Before I introduce our first speaker of the day, I just want to thank our gold sponsor, Datadog. Datadog is a global technology company that provides a cloud-based security and observability platform for cloud applications. And with that, I want to introduce our very first speaker of this year, Rami McCarthy. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. Thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to be here with you in Brussels for the inaugural Forward cloudsec Europe. This is how to 10x your cloud security without the Series D. It's a bit of a cumbersome title, but I take no credit for it. In 2020, my friend Clint Gibler gave this talk at B-Side San Francisco. Clint writes the TLDRsec newsletter and built on that experience of curating application security information to pull together the shared wisdom of application security teams in his circle and distill it down to actionable information he could then pass on. My hope is that I'm in the position this morning to do the same thing for cloud security. The talk is going to be about how to systemically and scalably raise the security bar in your organization. We're going to talk a lot about, tactics that you can apply, but also the higher level strategies and philosophy of a program that will scale successfully without just hiring 1 million people. To put this together, I leaned on this community and the broader community of cloud security experts. Logos are some of the many organizations, individuals, programs, projects I'll reference throughout this talk. The implication is that there are going to be 1 million references in a very dense slide deck, linking off so that you can follow up later. To that end, all the slides are going to be live right after the talk. You're welcome to take photos, but you don't have to worry about catching a specific link or tracking one down later. You'll be able to grab that directly. So I also want to admit something up front, which is I'm going to be referencing myself a lot. I've spent the past few weeks pushing out blog posts that I can just link off to save some time in this talk. If there's a link without a name associated, without a citation, it's probably my own. Sorry in advance. So I'm Rami. If you've seen this Scooby-Doo avatar in a security Slack or on Twitter, that's me. I've recently been on sabbatical for the past 6 months. I've written around 30 different articles or talks on all areas of security, as well as working with startups like TraceBit, who are a sponsor, thank you guys, as well as CrowdAlert, advising startups like P0 Security and Conducto, and being on the advisory board for Latio, which is a security advisory startup. So I've been keeping busy, but enjoying my time off. As part of that, I just moved to Europe. I'm going to pretend that this has nothing to do with being accepted to this conference, but thank you all for the warm early welcome. I'm excited to be here on a more permanent basis, but more on that later. So let's talk about the assumptions behind this talk and what it will take for it to be useful for you. My idea with this talk is to target it at people who are early in their cloud security maturity journey, maybe across the whole program, maybe just in slices, but you're able to make some investments in getting better. Unfortunately, if you are drowning in your program, if you are the single bulwark against the problems of cloud security, I don't think me giving you this 80-page slide deck is going to help much. Also, a note that early is really just a euphemism for immature in this case. I'm trying to be polite. I also index a lot on this philosophy of dashboards full of problems that has been circulating in the past few years. Chris wrote an article a couple years ago. Travis McPeak of Resourcely also published a talk on the topic. Fundamentally, there's this idea that historically security has focused on identifying and surfacing issues to the company. Security tools kick out 1 million tickets. The security team enriches those tickets, enhances them, passes them on. These dashboards have diminishing value. The more you do to build up thousands of findings, the less signal you're giving folks. And a big red dashboard of problems is overwhelming, not actionable. I think a big misstep we make in cloud security is looking at ways to make bigger, better, fuller dashboards through new data sources, new classes of vulnerability. And I think that that's sort of a distraction from incrementally actually fixing things and making them better. I'm also not going to tell you how to buy your way out of security. It's a valid approach. There are some wonderful vendors. Folks are sponsoring this conference. Thank you all. Picking and deploying products is its own skill set. I'm not going to look at. I think if you have the budget to like throw a Cadillac CNAP on your problem, maybe you should do that. Buy one of those products and cheat out some value. David White gave a talk at a previous Ford cloudsec that looks at how you might do a CSPM procurement that I think can be really helpful in this space. So before we get into the meat of tactics, I want to talk philosophy. I think there are some things I'll be able to cover today, but many of the situations you'll encounter, many of the problems of cloud security are obviously not going to fit in this talk. But I want to think about the ways in which we can establish a baseline approach to cloud security that we can then carry forward. I think a big hint is to just do the work. In engineering-oriented cloud security programs, we can get really fixated on building new, cool, automated solutions for problems and get distracted from the fact that sometimes 10 minutes of toil would save you 2 weeks of automation. But on an ongoing basis, you need to be turning towards automation as the only way you can scale without just hiring additional headcount. Phil Venables, who is a CISO over at Google Cloud, I think, has this blog post on moving security from artisanal to industrial that I really like. He talks about it for security programs as a whole, but I think it's a useful mindset to apply to any given problem, technology, tool, situation where you can look at what are the ways in which you can make your processes high reliability? How can you make your resilient solutions automated? This feels obvious, right? Everything in security is about high signal. I want to get a little more specific when I talk about picking high signal tools alerting, which is to say I would always trade off for simplicity and signal versus capabilities. I think good value decisions are all about having a reasonable trade-off where different programs could disagree. In my case, I would strongly recommend you consider deprioritizing broader coverage until you've really tuned a smaller subset and can derive value. This avoids those dashboards of problems and the whack-a-mole that can be downstream of that. But one way to action this is through distributed alerting. How do we make it so that our security alerts aren't bottlenecked on a security team to receive, triage, fix, dispatch? And I'll talk more on that later. Guardrails over gates, there's not much that hasn't been said about this. Philosophically, I think it's all about bounding a safe space for our engineers to operate without having to be in the loop on every problem. And this approach should be one of partnership, one where security is working with developers day to day, but it should be embedded in the development process. I think we as a security team are obligated to look at the ways developers are already working and adjust our program. And that's somewhere conferences like this and talks like mine can fall down, is we tell you one way of doing things and you bring it back to your very different company and try and copy it whole cloth without thinking about the idiosyncrasies of your environment. However, partnership has its drawbacks. Jacob Selassie gave this talk at Loco Moco Sec that I really enjoyed and would recommend. And he focused on the fact that partnership fundamentally doesn't scale. It's a meeting-oriented process often, and all we all need is more meetings. He also does a dig against security champions, which I know are an emerging popular approach, and I sort of back it up, which is to say security champions are us saying the security team needs help dealing with all of these meetings and all of these processes. Let's make it other people's responsibility as well. The philosophy he projects that every security consultation is a failure is not one I'm saying to never do consultation. Instead, what I'm trying to communicate there is that when you're going into your security program, you should have the mindset that you want to reduce, diminish, replace as much manual consultation as possible with better, more scalable solutions. So don't start turning down meetings because I said consultation's a failure. Instead, though, make sure that you're on an ongoing basis reducing the need for those meetings. Another developer-oriented, relationship-oriented practice, philosophy, is that I think it's important to come up with parts of your security program where you can actually have engineering build part of the solution. And then make sure that even non-engineers can operate these tools and processes. Security is about the whole company, and the more we focus on security engineering, the more we repeat some flaws of the past around forgetting UX, forgetting how to engage with the business where they are, and we try and funnel people into our tools and our approaches. Finally, I would say that there are limits to desirable security. Again, I'm giving a talk about all the things you can do, but I want to be very explicit that you probably shouldn't do them all. You probably shouldn't do everything you see at this conference today. For your business, for your capacity, for your risk, there is a fairly low ceiling on how secure you actually should be and how much time you should spend on it. A little bit of a props to vendors here. I know I said we're not going to talk about procurement, but I will say I've seen individuals undervalue what you can get from a free trial or a demo. A cool thing about security is that a lot of companies, especially startups, do product-led growth where they'll let you run a scan, take a look at the findings, assess your environment, get a preliminary conversation. And this is something that can take up too much of your time if you fall deep in the hole, but fundamentally can be an easy way to get some of the value from a larger procurement cycle without going through that commitment. And of course, if the product is that good, you should eventually pay them. Similarly, taking bets on startups, you need to be judicious with your time commitments here, but I think that you can always get value from a conversation on a new security approach, from sort of sprinkling some novelty and some innovation, both for your own engagement in your security program, so we're not solving open S3 buckets for the 15th time, or for the actual program gains. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk through for the rest of this. I'm going to start with digging deeper into the programmatics of scaling cloud security and the role invariants play. And then we're going to move on to sort of 4 categories that I think are key when you look at scaling a program, 4 places we commonly fall down: vulnerability and asset management, identity and access management, detection engineering, and deployment, basically how code gets to cloud, CI/CD. This is 6 sections. As of a few days ago, it was 8. We have 30 minutes, so we're going to dig into it. Cool. Security programs. Security programs, scaling your security program is all about attack surface. Your attack surface is going to constantly grow and snowball and accumulate unless you combat that. And so the only way you're going to get ahead is by rapidly and judiciously cutting off areas of risk. The first place this can happen is in account architecture. There's a million resources from the various cloud providers about how to set yourself up for success. And I think that we often see, if you're doing a cloud security journey, it's one of the first places you'll need to revisit from a lift and shift migration. Service and account allow lists, then, are a concept that can even further confine your attack surface. A problem with cloud is that all of the APIs are generally available by default. Authorization is obviously a layer. Google, for example, also allows you to enable services you need when you need them. Props to them. AWS does not do the same. Cutting down on the services you're using can take you from like 250 possible services used by an attacker to the 15, 20, 30, 50 your company actually uses. Zero trust and zero touch are also really helpful in decreasing attack surface. The fewer humans you have in production, the less risk you carry. I gave a whole talk about that at Forward CloudSec US. And Kane has a really great blog post walking through a sort of practical example of building out a zero trust program. Fundamentally, in these cases, you're building a baseline, you're seeking to meet it, you're seeking to enforce it with invariants, and then eventually raise that bar. This is all a form of ratcheting your security so that you're not going to constantly be plugging different holes in the wall and backsliding. In order to scale your security program, you need to make an argument for why security matters in terms of headcount, budget, investment. Security metrics are generally done pretty poorly. I don't have a better answer for you particularly. I think Alex gives a pretty pragmatic take on metrics, and this blog post can be useful if you want to refresh on some of the common mean time to remediate vulnerability metrics you'll see out in the wild. One thing he does call out, though, is that good vulnerability metadata is a predicate for good vulnerability metrics, and I think this is something we can pay attention to early. Often I have, back in my consulting days, come into a company and we're trying to prioritize security, but we're looking at like a list of unsorted Jira tickets that's thousands long, trying to figure out what the common issues are, and you end up just pattern matching to experience and saying, right, I guess we're fixing open S3 buckets again. So consider like gathering some metadata early on vulnerability classes, prevalence, impact, so that you can downstream care a little bit more about that. Colin Green focuses on product security a lot. He's currently at Meta, but I like his one easy KPI, which is comparing % of really severe bugs to your total bug density. This is useful because it has perverse incentives with increasing total number of bugs, but assuming everyone's acting ethically and in line with the intentions here, what I like about it is that we're focusing on actual risk reduction. It is pretty rare that your company is actually going to have a meaningful negative outcome from having some low-risk vulnerabilities floating around. And so this really looks at whether the controls you're putting in place are targeting your highest risks. He also links to an Uber post that discusses how to use bug bounty metrics and financial metrics to compare security investment to actual financial return, which is something we could all benefit from doing more of. Ryan, who I'm going to reference a few times, has an approach I haven't seen other folks talk about much. 2 long blog posts you'd have to dig into and chew on, but fundamentally he looks at expert estimation. This idea that one of the better KPIs is actually surveying some of the experts in your company and asking them how likely they think a specific incident vulnerability is to occur. And then you can measure the change over time and see whether your controls are decreasing perceived risk, with the assumption that perception is like a lossy approximation of actual risk. When you're doing these metrics, there's an approach I've been enjoying recently where you roll them up into team-level scorecarding that can then be surfaced up leadership chains. A problem with security metrics is often it is security pushing a metric to engineering. It is security saying, hi, why do you have more bugs this month? Or, welcome to SLA breach hell, please take a ticket. The security team isn't omniscient and has to avoid generating asymmetric work. I like scorecarding because subtly, if you can get to the point where engineering teams are bought in on a scorecard of their security metrics and their leadership is bought in on holding them to account, easier said than done, the relationship becomes us against the data versus security against developers. And I really like that model where you're actually sitting down with developers and saying, hey, why is this data bad? Let's fix it, versus trying to hold developers to account on any individual bug or SLA. El Kamtoff, who was the Snapchat CISO a few years ago, has a model of proactive efficiency that I think we could all learn from, which is why do we wait until we lose someone on the team and can't backfill them? Why do we wait until the company grows 30% and the security team gets no extra budget to start thinking about where we can pull some levers and make our life easier? Asking this one question about what we would do if we lost 30% capacity regularly, say on a quarterly basis in line with planning, gives you a chance to do a little better on being proactive in these efficiency investments. Okay, final bit on security programs. One easy trick. Security evangelism is great. You should all talk to your developers about security. How do we make developers care? Please don't do phishing training. I think fundamentally, though, security evangelism in your company should look at 2 simple questions that everyone should be able to answer. Everyone at your company should be able to answer how we'll get hacked and why we care. Basically, this is an alignment on top risks and an alignment on importance of security. And I think everyone should be able to answer these because alignment on top risk shows you're doing your job communicating outward, making people aware of what they need to worry about so they know they don't need to worry about everything else. And why security matters is important because if there isn't consensus on that, I would recommend seeking alternative employment. It's no fun doing security if people don't think security matters, and making sure you have a shared message on that. And security matters for different reasons. Maybe it's, we're PCI compliant and therefore have to do security. Maybe it's our customers are really security conscious. Maybe it is we got hacked 4 years ago and let's never have that happen again. It doesn't matter what your company's answer is, but I think that a better form of security onboarding for engineers would cover just these 2 points and you'd get most of the value. So, invariants. Invariants are a pretty big topic in cloud security, right? Especially because we can often enforce them at the API level. Alex has a blog post where he talks through the process of establishing invariants. And of course, sucking up to Chris some more, he has his own take on these cloud security invariants. What I'll say is that invariants are useful, but should only be applied when they're enforcing a truth that already exists. You shouldn't use invariants to try and fix a bad behavior. You need to fix the behavior and then lay out the invariant. Otherwise, you're interrupting ongoing operational processes. In AWS, these are service control policies. I have a wiki where I have a list of lists of service control policies. I think that there are about 1 million different places where everyone from AWS to Scott Piper to Chris to cloudsec has created a list of SCPs. They're worth what you pay for them. As I said, don't go copy paste as many of these as possible into your AWS organization. Similarly, I mentioned service allow listing earlier. Kinnaird spoke at Forward cloudsec about how you can implement this for Azure, and I have my own blog post about how to do this for AWS. You'll note I'm referencing Forward cloudsec a lot. It's not because I'm speaking at Forward cloudsec. It's because we're lucky enough that many Forward cloudsec talks hold up years later and actually give you practical advice for practitioners. So, what do we do about vulnerabilities? I see this as a pretty large part of cloud security and security in general. There are a lot of problems in security you can reduce down to vulnerability management if you squinted it right. You, of course, start up with asset inventory. In the cloud, something specific to call out is that historic resource metadata is really important. Often we'll use a tool like a CSPM or do regular cloud scanning, and we only focus on the point-in-time data. And once you have this historic data, you can use it, for example, during forensic investigations retroactively. You can use it to retroactively generate metrics, which can be really powerful. If you have historic data, you can actually realize 6 months in that maybe you do want a nice graph of IMDS v1 usage going down. This blog post from Jake uses Wiz and Snowflake specifically, but the topic is sort of general. But it shows how once you have this data in a data lake, somewhere accessible, queryable, you can pretty easily throw together reports. In this case, it's on vulnerability severity and cloud service provider breakdown. I think a big part of vulnerability management is hygiene. This is what I would consider snacking when you're doing security work. It's a useful thing and you should spend a little time on it, but you definitely shouldn't find yourself devoting 20 hours every week to cleaning up hygienic issues in your cloud. Hygienic issues are things like unused assets that you can clean up, and also ownership issues. Over time, if you can gradually resolve these, you'll just have less messy data to deal with. And financial operations is a really good lever here. Oftentimes, a company will finally fix ownership when some executive wants business unit level data on resource consumption in cloud environments. Working on this sort of financially oriented problem can also give you a little bit of bonus of not looking like a cost center. Security is constantly just like a negative line item. I have personally saved millions of dollars in deleting data in cloud environments, and you could too. And it buys you a little bit of ability to turn on security controls when you can show that you've offset them. What's nice about cloud vulnerabilities, especially in the control plane, is they're fairly homogeneous. If you are looking at a list of cloud vulnerabilities, there's probably a few dozen common ones, from S3 bucket issues to EC2 instance issues. Historically, I always would use Cloud Conformity's knowledge base if I need to like write up a finding for an engineering team. They've done a really good job at compiling, decent language explaining what the problem is and how to fix it for cloud vulnerabilities. More recently, Datadog has rolled out their Cloud Security Atlas, which I like as well because it goes and shows you a real-world instance tied to that data, which is something I'm fond of. One trick for managing vulnerabilities, especially when we talk about distinguishing between this sort of dashboard full of problems, is to use confidence ratings. Jamie wrote this and used an example from putting confidence ratings in Brakeman, which I think was probably about a decade ago now, the Ruby SaaS tool. Overall, I haven't seen most cloud security tools kick out any sort of confidence rating, but I feel like we all establish our own gut instinct on which vulnerabilities are likely to be real and which ones are unlikely. And so thinking about ways that you can either get confidence from your tools or provide confidence downstream to engineers can be really helpful. Getting bugs fixed is the most important part about managing vulnerabilities. None of this matters if you're not actually fixing the bugs in production. Colin has one of the deepest dives I've seen into actually walking engineers through the stages of grief around getting a bug report. I think it's pretty rare we talk about that sort of practicality. He talks about both like our obligations around checking ourselves that prioritization is correct, and also about what maybe a clean reminder language is. This phrase that like you are in the small minority of people who've not fixed your open security bug is a sentence that he stole from some psychology textbook effectively to try and encourage people to, keep up with the Jones there. Okay, identity and access management. To talk about identity and access management, I'm really looking to tell you why we spend all our time on identity and access management and fail to scale our programs. Will and Devon have a really good talk about like how they've actually scaled a program over 5 years at HashiCorp. Focused on a couple tips are direct federation versus chained role assumption. They have more evidence here. I've seen the same thing. It's easier to scale least privilege and audit access if you're not checking in on role chaining. They also talk about starting with zero access and doing auto approval. This is a hobby horse of mine, to use just-in-time access as a way to keep humans least privileged while still letting them do their jobs. There's been a resurgence in open source here. Discord recently launched the first new tool for just-in-time cloud access, open source tool I've seen in a few years, and they're putting a lot of investment behind it. I believe it only supports AWS right now, but they're open to extending it more. And they spoke at both Loco MocoSec and B-Sides SF, sort of doing the rounds on how you can automate some of this human permission management. Absolute minimal privilege is not desirable security. A problem with least privileging IAM is that both the usage is always changing, and also our bar for security is always changing, and then you add to that the cloud service providers are always changing out from under you. The idea that you'll be able to consistently reduce privileges down to just what people need just when they need them, or even worse, just what services need just when they need them, is a bit of a trap. This came up at the Birds of a Feather in Virginia at Forward CloudSec, actually. This conversation that like you're probably chasing your tail if you're trying to actually least privilege everything on an ongoing basis. Good enough is good enough here. For humans, I feel like good enough looks like service level least privileging. That gets you down to a small reasonable attack surface, probably with some carve out for crown jewels, your core databases. Chris has a repository he put together, I believe, for Corey Quinn on sensitive IAM actions. This can be a useful second pass if you have additional capacity. Like, why worry about the 80% of cloud APIs that don't matter? If you really want to stop and think deeper than the service level, I think what you need to care about is especially some of this data access privilege escalation class of APIs. And what's nice is having them programmably consumable, so you can start to automate this. We're also looking at infrastructure access. When you're trying to scale your program, I mentioned zero touch. I've given a whole talk on it. The short version is that you probably want a WireGuard VPN, and you probably don't want people SSHing into prod, and that will get you far enough that you can get through probably to IPO, probably any compliance scheme you've heard of, without worrying further. Like, are there better approaches? Yes. Can you do more? Yes. But to scale, you have to make a decision where to stop in these areas, and this is about where I draw the line. For services, I think cleaning up unused access periodically is worthwhile. And I hate to say this in 2024, but please get yourselves on IMDS-v2 if you're in AWS. Thankfully, other cloud providers offer a better default. I say this because Slack just published a blog post on how they got themselves onto IMDS-v2. It's hard when you're a big company with legacy debt, but clearly big organizations are still struggling with one of the more important parts of secure service identity. Detection engineering. So there's been a movement towards detection engineering as opposed to the traditional idea of like a SOC being off in the corner and not something people pay attention to in their core security program. Cloud's a big driver, in my opinion, because in cloud security, a lot of the detection surface is just cloud APIs, and so it gets mingled in with other cloud security responsibilities. Often cloud security teams are writing detections themselves versus having any other responsible party. Alan's given 2 talks on detection engineering programs that I've really enjoyed and would recommend. He talks both about like the metrics for the program and also approaches. He's a pretty good storyteller and shares his experiences at Airbnb in a way I appreciate. So Ryan's back again. Thank you, Ryan, for publishing this blog post last night. So I'm bringing you only the freshest content. This is me getting quoted in Cloud Security Forum being all for half-assing detection. Just like I said about IAM, I actually think we over-index on detection because it's really satisfying to think this is how I'm going to catch the bad guys. And it's also really easy to view a huge surface of possibility for detection when we're constantly writing detections that will fire too much and we'll get annoyed, or will never fire. And that was a good use of time. Ryan has a much better constructed framing of this same please half-ass detections. And I don't know that he would back that statement. But the point stands that there is a limited amount of value in continuously writing detections. 7 years ago, he gave some lessons in detection engineering, focused on the fact that if you're doing detection engineering, you should approach it as an engineering problem. You should think about both like the work you're creating downstream and also how it's being actioned. You should keep metrics on how alerts are being triaged, whether they're true positives or false positives. And most importantly here, he says, like, don't pretend every alert is worth being paged. And I'd similarly say that, like, question the severity of every alert. I think probably if you took a really hard look and thought about what really matters, half of your high alerts could be medium, 2/3 of your mediums could be lows, and most of those shouldn't exist anyway, because what's the point? Again, mileage may vary. I alluded to this earlier. Distributed alerting can really help scale your program because instead of keeping security in the loop, where security needs to take an alert, figure out what user was involved, DM that user, ask them whether they intended to delete that database, and do that full circuit, you should just automate that process. You should have your tooling directly ping engineers who are implicated in issues, and you should trust your engineers to provide some feedback on whether the issue is a security issue or behavior as usual. This user interaction is even better if you add MFA confirmation, and thankfully there's like a cute little library that will give you MFA confirmation WebAuthn on the CLI. But overall, there's steps of automation. I think that the like silver bullet is user interaction, but you can also consider maybe the broader SOC automation capability matrix. Okay, I've made it like 80% of the way into this talk, 90%, and I haven't mentioned AI. Here's your mandatory AI LLM slide. Yes, yes, claps for AI. This is actually really good though. Matt Knight works on security at OpenAI and spoke at the AI Cyber Challenge on how OpenAI is using ChatGPT to do security. And they also open sourced a lot of the relevant prompts and automation. AI is an emerging technology, value to be determined, I would still say, but it's useful to see how teams that are heavily adopting AI are applying it. Notably, they have actually used a chatbot for the sort of human interaction I've talked about. They're using AI in the SDLC to try and figure out what tickets need security attention. They're doing access requests through a LLM-enabled workflow to better help folks find what role, what permissions they need to get their job done. I think these are all ideas many folks have had and many companies have tried. If there are efficiency gains to be had in LLMs, we sorely need them in cloud security, and so I'd pay attention to this space. When we're talking about detection engineering, we spend a lot of time writing detections. I just want to share, because I feel like people miss one or more of these. There are 4 separate, really big repositories of cloud-relevant detections out there on GitHub, free like a puppy, which is to say it's going to be a lot of work and they're worth what you pay for them, but it can be a useful reference if you're writing your own. I also can't go any further without mentioning that I think to scale your detection, canaries are really useful. I've written a lot about canaries recently, but I think we've always in this forward cloudsec sphere talked about canary tokens and leaving AWS credentials around to be found. I wrote this maturity model to sort of look at the landscape of how you can go further than just canary tokens in order to have high signal detections of attackers actually wandering around your environment. Okay, last topic. I wish I could give a whole talk on deployment security, on how we're securing our CI/CD processes, how we're securing our Terraform automation, because my understanding is that for the most part, if you hire a really good cloud-focused red team, this is probably how they're going to get you. They're going to get you through your GitHub, through your GitLab, through your CI/CD. They'll probably also phish you, but like that's not really interesting to me as a cloud security person. Mike Ruth has the best talks on this topic. Like I said, I really wanted to talk about it here, but they accepted this talk instead, so hopefully at a future forward cloudsec, I'll be able to give a deep dive on deployment security. Okay, look, that was all a lot of links, a lot of detail. You're going to pick and choose from it. Hopefully you saw something you want to follow up on. Practically, pragmatically, if you're doing a revamp of your program, what's the 30, 60, 90? This is always what we care about. In the next 30 days, you can look at the state of your program and focus on relationships. Security is about partnership. Cloud security especially coexists with DevOps teams, with platform teams really tightly. Don't go in and say that, I said add all these SCPs and now drop them on your DevOps team's head. Won't go well. But look at what baseline you do have, because I think it's probably true that you're in pretty good shape if you're in this room, and you have some areas where you have real strength you can sort of celebrate. In 60 days, do one thing better and make sure you nail it. You don't get a lot of chances to make meaningful changes to cloud security philosophy, especially if you're in an organization that has, maybe a more traditional approach to security teams, maybe is running a traditional SOC, maybe is new to the cloud. Whatever you pick, make sure you get the change right. It's really hard because people swing for the fences and miss, and it's a hard hole to dig out of. And then this is where you can start actually enforcing that baseline you've observed. And then in 90 days, it's all about reproducibility. It's all about thinking long term. But notably, it's about ROI. And this is where desirable security comes in. After 90 days of working on scaling cloud security, you should sit down and think about how much is enough and where are you going to stop. This is not a journey that you should set out on with a North Star of like perfect cloud security. Instead, you should talk about, look at, how do we want our detection to look? How do we want our IAM to look? What do we need from our vulnerability management program? And then kill a class of risk. Whether this is migrating to IMDS v2, whether this is saying, you know, there will never be another public S3 bucket under my watch, pick something, fix it for good, move on to the next thing. Congratulations on raising money. If you actually have a Series D, I would say that like these are the things that are worthwhile that I wouldn't recommend otherwise. In the product categories, like probably something that does runtime security, probably something that preps you for instant response. Maybe we can get one of those fancy data perimeters I'm hearing so much about. I would love a security platform engineering team to build all of my dreams. And then there are log sources like VPC flow logs that I can barely afford to turn on, let alone look at. So I think the like point I'm making here, though, is that this stops pretty soon in what is possible in cloud security, and that's intentional. At a certain point, I hope you all have free reign to like do whatever you want in cloud security, and maybe these are some next steps. So let's leave you with the takeaways. Build guardrails, offer secure defaults. The things I talked about are the things you should do the least of or do less than you were planning on. Collect minimum viable data to inform investments. And I've moved to Europe. I'm probably going to be wrapping up my sabbatical. So if you know cool companies in Europe, or if you are personally a cool company in Europe, I don't know how that works, feel free to chat to me later. Thank you all.
Thank you. Are there any questions from Rami? I'll be coming around with a microphone. I do have one question from the Slack that I'll start with. So what are the 2 topics you had to leave out, and what did we miss?
Okay, you didn't miss anything because you can go find all the extra slides over at the link. Configuration as code is somewhere I wanted to dive deeper. Configuration as code is a big part of scaling secure cloud security, which is to say, if you're not using IAC and you have humans making changes in your environment, you're kind of screwed. It's really hard. Ask Chris about that journey. The other thing was runtime security. There isn't much to be said on runtime security in the cloud at a shallow level, but I basically wanted to make a point that like instead of fighting patching, fight to make it so you don't have to patch. And if you're using Kubernetes, please use managed Kubernetes. Don't administer it yourself in the cloud.
Thank you, Rami. Are there any questions from the crowd? Raise your hand. I'll be coming with a microphone. Yes.
So if you could eliminate one classes of bugs yourself or like vulnerabilities, which one would you remove from the earth?
I think I tend to worry about publicly accessible services, and it really ends up being environmentally dependent. But generally, I've seen that organizations have between like 1 and 6 ways of commonly deploying a service and making it public, right? Maybe you use Lambdas, maybe you have a standard API gateway, maybe you have a NAT gateway, maybe you have something old, maybe you do S3 buckets. And so if I could go from having those standards to having a paved road with boundaries on it so that only the services that are public are the ones we intend, I think that's where I'd look first in a company with a like moderate maturity level.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the crowd? We have one in the back there. Yeah, that's the other microphone.
Thank you. I know you mentioned you wanted to do a talk on CI/CD security in general, but I guess the most important question that I have here is how do you secure things like CI/CD runners? Because I usually need to have permissions for Terraform, admin, those kind of things, and that's, I would say, the
Yes, yeah, I think it's very hard and complicated. I did a year of work on that at a previous employer. The takeaway I would leave folks with is that there are two choices, or there are two options. You can either let everyone run a Terraform plan or not. And most of the talks I've seen say, don't let everyone run a Terraform plan because if you know anything about Terraform, running a Terraform plan is actually code execution. Like if you let people run a plan, you just have to accept they're going to be running arbitrary code on your runners. I've picked the harder path, and I think that basically you're looking at a pattern of static analysis, defense in depth, isolating runners, signing packages, right? There's this long chain of controls that all serve to make it so that you can actually say yes to your developers on running Terraform plans, because otherwise no one's going to write Terraform, which, if we're being honest, no developer really wants to write Terraform in the first place.
fair enough.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, we have one over here. 1 second.
Thank you. Just was curious, Rami, if you have you seen any companies or use cases like where they successfully leveraged VPC flow log for network detection?
I have seen VPC flow logs effectively used in incident cases and nowhere else. I think they're really useful, but I think just at the volume of data you're looking at and with how immature intra-network security can be in AWS environments often, it's more so that I haven't seen it. I also have not worked at some of the big guns, so like I'm sure the Netflixes of the world are doing something. But in my experience, the average company does is they turn them on, they store them, and if there's an incident, you can use them to look at traffic patterns and determine what impacted services, what data exfil might have happened.
More questions? We still have time.
Hi there. I was going to ask, all of those topics that you went through, some of them might be like represented by a team, so different teams. Do you have any advice on how to work together to get to that ultimate, like, secure cloud security landscape?
Yeah, it's a great point, and frankly, one that doesn't come to mind as someone coming from such small organizations, so I really appreciate you raising it. What do we do if there are teams that have responsibility for some of these domains that have such a big impact on cloud security? Frankly, this is a soft skills problem more so than a hard skills problem. I think that when I talk about scorecarding and metrics, those are some of the tactics I've seen. Specifically, if you can get a team to align on the approach to security, you're okay to allow them to specify the details. So for example, if you find scorecarding valuable, finding a way to encourage a vulnerability management organization to adopt that and let them specify the metrics, right? Like maybe you need to slide your cloud security ones in there, but fundamentally, like let them own the problem and find ways to make it serve you. I think the other thing is fundamentally, if you're in the larger an organization you're in, the less it's likely to change, and the more you have to think about what you can do outside of changing your organization. And so that might be where you fall back on maybe cloud security issues are configuration issues and not vulnerabilities, and therefore we handle them upstream of our formal vulnerability management process so that we have a little more latitude to, appropriately modify severity, fix things rapidly without them going through a centralized flow, right? Unfortunately, sometimes you just have to think about where your APIs are with other teams, like human APIs, and then do as much as you can upstream of that handoff point. I think vulnerabilities, particularly IAM as well. In IAM, the example would be often you have an IT org responsible for like Okta or for whatever your IDP is for Active Directory. If you can get them to agree to like own group creation, you can then do all sorts of clever things on the cloud side downstream of those groups and identity information. And so figuring out like where to draw the line so that you're benefiting from their expertise without getting stuck maybe in some of their workflows or processes or velocity can be helpful.
Hey, can I ask for some words of wisdom on multi-cloud and hybrid? Like, let's say it's day 1000 at the job and someone says, Rami, we want to use another CSP for something.
Yeah. If I don't work there, that sounds great. If I work there, please don't. No. I think, so actually the point I'd make, and fun fact, I have slides on multi-cloud that I didn't include in here. Chris has done a blog post on multi-cloud as well that I looked at. I think fundamentally you probably are multi-cloud. In previous organizations, like if you publish a VS Code extension, you end up with an Azure subscription. If you're using Google SSO in your product, you probably have GCP projects, and those have cracked open the door. It's that whole risk reduction, attack surface reduction that I think is important, which is to say, if you're going multi-cloud, why are we going multi-cloud? Hopefully we're going multi-cloud either, not a good idea necessarily, but just saying like for a security perspective, if it's to run our Kubernetes workloads in a second cloud provider, okay, my problem space is now Kubernetes. How do I limit the attack surface to only actually be exposed to the problem space of the Kubernetes service? If it is, we need to do AI in Google because Google has the best AI, or we need to do AI in Azure, Azure has the best AI. Again, how can we limit it so that only the necessary people only have access to the necessary services? That's step one. Step two is generally you need an expert per cloud, and that's a way to pitch it from a metrics and staffing perspective, is it's gonna be really hard for any one person to be your expert across all three cloud providers. And I found that you can actually proactively talk about the business case for multi-cloud. I've written a doc at my past two employers where I say, if we were to go multi-cloud, please understand that these are the things that would need to happen, one of which is staffing. And you can build that alignment on like cost implications of multi-cloud from a support perspective before it ever comes up urgently, so that when the exec signs the statement of work with Google for $10 million, you at least can point back to prior arrangements on what that means for being able to be successful there.
Thank you, Rami. I think that's all the time we had for questions, so we'll soon be welcoming the next speaker.